Freedom of the press is in the spotlight as autocratic regimes crack down on journalism and even exert influence abroad. Joining me live is Executive Director of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom and Macquarie University Professor of Journalism, Peter Greste. Hi there, Peter. Of course, it's interesting that two ex-detained journalists are having this discussion. We've got between us 5 years of jail time. Where do you see the future of journalism? For example, in Hong Kong and also in the Asian region, where censorship is very heavy.
Look, I'm very worried about it. I mean, you mentioned Hong Kong, and you were just speaking to Sebastian Lai about an hour ago. It is really troubling to see the way in which the government in Hong Kong is using really spurious national security law to come after, frankly, uncomfortable journalism. This is a trend that we've seen taking place right across the world. The way in which governments have used national security legislation, but also increasingly things like tax law and regulation to come after not just individual journalists, but also to put enormous pressure on the companies themselves. Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai's company is one of those, but we've also seen that in the Philippines with Rappler. Maria Ressa, of course, is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. We've seen, as you mentioned, a lot of censorship across the region. And so I think and Russia, tremendous problems in Russia. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, has just gone on trial in another case that is utterly spurious. Around the world, there are record numbers of journalists behind bars, 320 at the moment, according to the CPJ's last count, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. And that is really troubling trend. We had thought that things might ease in recent years, but the situation's gotten far worse. And I think the ways in which governments are using both national security legislation on the one hand and things like tax law and others to go after companies is setting a trend that is stifling press freedom, not just across the region, but also across the world.
Yep, so laws and regulations being weaponised to shut down critics. How do ordinary citizens protect journalistic freedom? Could there be a role for citizen journalism?
As far as I'm concerned, there's just journalism, whether it's produced by citizens or people who aren't full-time reporters, who aren't necessarily trying to badge journalists. Exactly. As far as I'm concerned, there's just journalism, and where it comes from is really immaterial. What we need people to do, though, is to recognise the importance of journalism that is produced according to professional and ethical standards. And I think that's the key here. We also need the public to get behind it. I know a lot of people are turning off news. The statistics for news avoidance are pretty troubling at the moment. But a world without journalists holding governments to account, doing the kind of investigative journalism that we've seen that has brought down or exposed a whole raft of bad behaviour by governments, of abuses of power and authority by governments.
But that takes money, and
so
the business is difficult.
It takes enormous amounts. It takes money, it takes time, and takes resources. The problem is that the business models at the moment are collapsing. Every news organisation, pretty much certainly in this country and most of those around the world, are really struggling. And we need to figure out a way of financing journalism to allow it to do its job, perform its role in a functioning democracy. This is a complex, difficult problem. It's politically difficult to achieve the kind of results that we need to get that outcome. But if we imagine a world without journalism, where all we have is the social media posts of our governments and politicians and commentary, that's not the kind of world in which I particularly want to live in. I don't think too many people would agree that makes for an effective democracy. It's a real problem, but we need to support journalism.
Finally, very quickly, Peter, we're running out of time.
Yep.
But our journalists are currently still reporting on China outside China. How is it possible to bring them back after what happened to me?
Look, Lei, it's an incredibly difficult one. I think it would take a very brave journalist to go back to work inside China, if you're an Australian in particular, and someone in your position. But it has to happen. We need coverage. Journalists can work through other creative means. They can work with networks and contacts inside the country, but it's just not the same as being there. And I think this is also a problem for China, because it needs journalists who understand the country to be able to explain it and report it in a way that is accurate and fair, but also
so much
analyses it
for
in a way
your
we can all
time.
make sense of.